The cold came first. It always did, in that part of the village. The part where the streets were too narrow for the morning sun to reach, where the stone walls exhaled the chill they had swallowed through the night and kept it close until well past midday. Alice had learned to stop fighting it. She simply pulled her gray wool cloak tighter across her chest, tucked her braid over one shoulder to keep the wind from catching it, and walked. The satchel on her back was nearly empty. A heel of bread wrapped in cloth, a small knife for peeling roots, and a rolled letter she hadn't been able to bring herself to open yet. She already knew what it said. The landlord had been sending the same letter, in slightly different words, for the past 3 months. Pay by the new moon, or find yourself another roof. She didn't look at the other villagers as she passed them, not because she was proud. Alice had long since burned through any pride that might have gotten in the way of survival, but because she didn't want to see their pity, or worse, their relief. Relief that it was her struggling, and not them. She was 24 years old, and she had been on her own since she was 19. 5 years of quiet, stubborn endurance. 5 years of knowing exactly how much a loaf of bread cost, how many hours of mending work it took to earn a copper coin, and how far a single coin could stretch if you were careful enough and hungry enough and desperate enough. She was all three that morning. The building she stopped in front of was unremarkable. Gray stone, narrow windows, a wooden sign above the door that had been repainted so many times, the original words were buried beneath layers of different intentions. What remained was simple: the collection house. Below that, in smaller letters, all blood given freely is blood given in honor. Alice had first come here 2 years ago, driven by nothing more noble than the notice pinned to the village board. Voluntary blood donors compensated. Monthly contributions accepted. Inquire within. She had inquired within. What she found was a quiet room smelling of pine resin and dried herbs, a woman named Dortha, with gray-streaked hair and calm eyes, and a simple wooden chair beside a low table. The process was explained without ceremony. A small cut on the inner arm, not deep, hardly more than a graze. The blood drawn into a sealed clay vessel, dark red and strange against the pale ceramic. And at the end, 2 silver coins placed in her palm, without comment or judgment. 2 silver coins, once a month, for 2 years. Alice had never asked what the blood was for. She told herself it was because she was practical. What did it matter? She gave something she could spare. Her body made more of it, Dortha had assured her with a sensible nod. And she received something she could not spare. Money. The arrangement was clean, honest. She preferred clean and honest things. But there were moments, walking home after each visit with the coins warm in her fist, when a question surfaced, despite her best efforts to keep it submerged. Where does it go? The clay vessels were always collected by a courier, a hooded figure who came and went so quietly Alice had only glimpsed him twice. He carried the vessels in a padded wooden case, strapped to his chest as though they held something far more precious than a poor woman's blood. She had pushed the question back down every time. She was good at that. This morning, she pushed open the door of the collection house and stepped inside, grateful for the warmth that met her. A fire crackled in the small hearth in the corner. The room smelled of beeswax candles and something faintly medicinal. Dried valerian root, perhaps, or the particular clean sharpness of boiled linen. Dortha looked up from behind the low table. Her expression shifted, just slightly, in a way Alice had never quite been able to read. "You're early," the older woman said. The wind made it feel later than it was. Alice set her satchel down and began to unfasten her cloak. "Is something wrong?" Dortha didn't answer immediately. She was arranging things on the table with more care than the task required. The small copper blade, the linen strip, the sealed vessel waiting to receive what Alice had come to give. Her hands moved slowly, deliberately. "There's a man outside," Dortha said finally. "He's been there since before dawn." Alice paused with her cloak half off. What kind of man? The kind that doesn't come to places like this. Dortha looked up, and for the first time in 2 years, Alice saw something in those calm gray eyes that she had never seen before. Fear. He asked for you by name, Alice. The cloak slipped from her fingers. She caught it before it hit the floor, but barely. He doesn't know you, Dortha added quickly. He doesn't know anything about you except your name, and that you come here. I told him nothing else. I want you to know that. Who is he? The older woman's jaw tightened. She looked down at the table, then back up, and when she spoke, her voice was low and very careful. He gave no name, but the courier who came last week, the one who collects the vessels. He told me something before he left. She hesitated. He told me that the blood we send north has been keeping someone alive, someone important, someone who has been ill for a very long time with something that does not respond to any treatment except... She stopped. Alice felt the cold again, despite the fire. It had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. Except what? She asked. Dortha looked at her with something that might have been apology, or might have been the particular grief of a woman who has kept a secret for 2 years and has just watched it escape. Except yours, she said quietly. Only yours, Alice. We have 23 other donors. None of them helped. For 2 years, we have sent blood from all of them, and only one set of vessels has made any difference at all. The fire popped. Outside, the wind pressed against the narrow window. That's not possible, Alice said. Her voice was steadier than she felt. Blood is blood. So I thought. Dortha folded her hands on the table. So any reasonable person would think. The door behind Alice opened. She turned without meaning to, some deep, wordless instinct pulling her body around before her mind had given the instruction. The draft from outside was sharp and cold, and smelled of pine and leather and something darker beneath both, like iron left out in the rain. The man who stepped through the doorway was enormous. Not simply tall, though he was that, his braided black hair nearly brushing the low beam above the door, but built in a way that made the room feel as though it had quietly rearranged itself around him. He wore a leather vest crossed with thick straps, bracers on both forearms, a belt heavy with the weight of things that served purposes she didn't want to think about too carefully. Around his shoulders, a fur-lined cloak, black as soot. His eyes found her immediately. They were an unsettling shade of blue, not pale, not soft, but deep and very still, the color of a lake just before a storm decides what it wants to do. There was a thin scar across his left cheekbone, older than it looked, faded silver against brown skin. He looked at her the way a man looks at something he has been searching for long enough that the sight of it no longer brings relief. Only a kind of terrible, complicated recognition. "You're Alice," he said. It wasn't a question. She lifted her chin. "Who are you?" He was quiet for a moment. In that moment, she noticed that his left hand, hanging at his side, was trembling, very slightly, nearly imperceptibly, the way a flame trembles in a draft so faint you can't feel it on your skin. "My name is Sebastian," he said, "and I owe you my life." Alice did not move. She stood with her cloak gathered against her chest, her braid falling over one shoulder, and she looked at this man, this enormous, terrifying, strangely trembling man. And she did the only thing she could think to do. She took a step back. "I don't know you," she said. The words came out more firmly than she expected. "I don't know what you want, and I don't know how you found me, but I think you have the wrong person." "I don't." Sebastian's voice was low and unhurried, the kind of voice that had spent a long time learning not to rush, not to raise itself. Because it didn't need to. Everything about him communicated the same thing, a stillness so complete it felt almost like a warning. "You come here the 3rd morning of every month. You have done so for 2 years. You are 24 years old. Your name is Alice Voss. You live on Cotter's Lane, in the room above the grain merchant's storage. The cold she had felt earlier returned, harder this time. If you know where I live, she said quietly, then you don't need to introduce yourself. You already know everything about me. Something crossed his face. Not guilt exactly, but something adjacent to it. A flicker of awareness that he had misjudged his opening. He shifted his weight slightly, and in that movement she caught it again. The faint, almost invisible tremor in his left hand. He noticed her noticing, and he closed that hand into a fist at his side. I came to speak with you, he said, not to frighten you. You're doing both. Behind Alice, Dortha had gone very still. She was watching Sebastian the way a small animal watches something it has decided not to provoke. Attentive, motionless, breath held shallow. Sebastian looked past Alice at the older woman. Give us a moment. It was not a request. The words had the shape of one, but not the weight. Dortha hesitated for only a breath before she rose from her chair, collected the small copper blade and linen strips with careful hands, and retreated through the narrow door at the back of the room. The latch clicked softly behind her. Alice did not appreciate being managed that way. She turned back to face him and let him see it in her expression. She didn't have to leave, Alice said. No, he agreed. But what I have to say is for you alone. He moved to the chair Dortha had vacated and lowered himself into it with a deliberateness that told her sitting was not entirely comfortable for him right now. Up close, with the firelight reaching him properly, she could see things she had missed in the first shock of his entrance. The skin beneath his eyes was shadowed, deeply so. There was a grayness beneath the brown of his complexion, a flatness to his color that had nothing to do with the cold outside. And his left hand, resting now on the table, had not stopped trembling. He was ill. Whatever she had expected, threat, demand, some kind of dangerous game, she had not expected this. The incongruity of it struck her somewhere unguarded. This towering, armored, scarred man sitting in the humble wooden chair of the collection house, looking like he had spent the last 2 years fighting something he hadn't quite been able to beat. Sit, he said, and then, catching himself, added, Please. She sat. Not because he asked, but because she needed a moment to think, and thinking was easier when her legs weren't tense and ready to carry her out the door. He studied her face for a long moment before he spoke. The fire shifted and settled. Outside, the wind moved through the narrow street with a low sound like something breathing. 3 years ago, Sebastian began, I was poisoned. Alice said nothing. Not with anything that can be treated by common means. Not with herbs or heat or rest. It was a specific, deliberate poison. Something compounded over years by someone who understood our kind well enough to know exactly where our defenses fail. He paused. I don't know if Dortha told you what I am. She told me nothing about you. He accepted this with a small nod. Then I will tell you myself. My pack holds the Northern Territories, the land beyond the Ashford Ridge, stretching as far as the Greymere forests. I am alpha of that pack. And 3 years ago, someone decided they wanted that territory badly enough to do what needed to be done to take it. Alpha. The word settled into the room with a particular kind of gravity. Alice knew what it meant, in the way that anyone living within 50 miles of wolf territory understood, not from personal experience, but from the careful, collective knowledge that villages accumulated over generations. Stories passed down not as legend, but as practical information. Alphas were the governing force of every wolf pack, the final authority, the strongest fighter, the one whose health was bound to the survival of every wolf beneath them. If an alpha fell, the pack fractured. And fractured packs were dangerous in ways that affected everyone, human villages included. The poison attacks the blood, Sebastian continued, his voice careful and measured. It breaks down something essential in it. Our healers couldn't find a counter-agent. Not in the first year, not in the second. By the third year, he stopped. His jaw tightened. My second in command was already making preparations. Preparations, Alice repeated, for what follows an Alpha's death. His eyes met hers steadily. It is not a peaceful process. She thought of the villages north of the Ashford Ridge, the families there, the children. She pushed the thought aside because she didn't want it softening her yet. She needed to understand the full shape of this before she let herself feel anything about it. So someone found my blood, she said, and it helped. It didn't just help. For the first time, something changed in his expression. Not warmth exactly, but the absence of the rigid control he had been holding over his face. It reversed it. Slowly, month by month, the damage began to repair. Our healers could not explain it. They still can't, not fully. There is something in your blood, Alice, that acts against the specific compounds of that poison in a way nothing else has. No other donor we found produced the same effect. Only you. She sat with this information the way she sat with most difficult things, quietly, turning it over, looking at it from different angles. I'm human, she said. I know. A human woman from the poor end of a village nobody has heard of, who comes here once a month for 2 silver coins. She heard the edge in her own voice and didn't try to soften it. That seems improbable. Yes, he said simply. It does. And yet here you are. And yet here I am. The fire popped again. A log shifted, sending a brief shower of sparks upward that faded before they reached the chimney throat. Alice looked at his trembling hand on the table, and then looked back at his face. You said you owe me your life, she said. What does that mean to a man like you? Why come here in person? Why not just send more coin or a letter or nothing at all? The question hung in the warm air between them. Sebastian was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, because 2 weeks ago our courier was intercepted. The last 3 vessels he was carrying were destroyed before they reached our healers. Alice went still. The damage has already begun to reverse, he said, and there was something in his voice now she hadn't heard before, something that cost him to put into words. But without continued treatment, it will not hold. And whoever poisoned me 3 years ago has just made it very clear that they know exactly how I have been surviving. He held her gaze. Which means they know about you. The cold outside pressed against the window glass. I came, Sebastian said, because leaving you here is no longer something I am willing to do. Alice did not sleep that night. She lay on her narrow straw mattress, still wearing her linen dress, because the cold had crept through the gaps in the wall boards, and the single wool blanket she owned was not enough to fight it properly. And she stared at the dark ceiling and thought about what Sebastian had said. Leaving you here is no longer something I am willing to do. She had told him no. She had told him clearly, with both hands flat on the table between them and her voice as steady as she could keep it, that she was not going anywhere with a stranger, Alpha or otherwise. Based on a conversation that lasted less than half an hour, she had told him that she understood the situation was serious. She had told him that she was sorry about the intercepted courier, that she was sorry about the poison, that she was sorry about all of it. And then she had put her cloak back on and walked out. He had not followed her. She had listened for footsteps behind her all the way down the narrow street, her shoulders braced against the possibility, but they never came. She had reached her door and gone inside and climbed the creaking stairs to her room and sat on the edge of her mattress for a long time before she remembered to breathe properly. That had been hours ago. Now the village was deep in the quiet of late night. The wind had dropped to almost nothing, and the frost was settling onto the window glass in slow, branching patterns she could see by the faint moonlight. She was thinking about the courier, the hooded figure she had glimpsed twice, the careful way he carried the padded wooden case strapped to his chest. Someone had intercepted him. Someone had known where he would be and what he was carrying, and had destroyed those vessels deliberately. 3 months of her blood, gone. And whoever had done it knew her name. She turned onto her side and pulled the blanket tighter, and tried very hard to be sensible about this. She was a practical woman. She had survived 5 years alone through practicality, not through bravery or luck or any quality that made for good storytelling. She assessed situations. She made choices based on what was real rather than what she feared. What was real? A man had been slowly dying, and her blood had been keeping him alive. What was also real? Someone had just destroyed that supply and had demonstrated they were willing to escalate. What was uncomfortably, undeniably real? She was a single woman living alone above a grain merchant's storage room, with one knife suitable for peeling roots, and a landlord who didn't particularly care whether she lived or died as long as the rent arrived. She was not safe here. She had known it from the moment Sebastian said it. She had walked away anyway because she needed to think without those unsettling blue eyes watching her do it. By the time the frost on the window had spread to cover the lower panes entirely, she had made her decision. Sebastian had taken a room at the village's only inn, a low-ceilinged place that smelled of tallow candles and old straw, where the innkeeper asked no questions of men who looked like they could remove doors from their frames without much effort. He was not asleep when the knock came at his door just after midnight. He had not expected to sleep. He opened the door. Alice stood in the corridor with her gray cloak and her traveling satchel, her braid slightly loosened from whatever it had looked like that morning, her expression set in the particular way of a person who has made a difficult decision and intends to stand by it before they can talk themselves out of it. "I have conditions," she said. He stepped back from the doorway and let her in. The room was small and cold. The fire in the corner hearth burned down to embers that cast more shadow than light. He had maps spread across the small table, waited at the corners with his bracers and a hunting knife. She glanced at them briefly and then looked at him. "I'm not a prisoner," she said. "Not a captive, not a ward, not a resource. If I come with you, I come as a person who has made a choice. The moment that changes, I leave." "Agreed," he said. She studied him for a sign of hesitation and found none. This seemed to satisfy her only partially. "I know nothing about your pack, your territory, or your people. I will need to be told what I need to know in order to navigate this safely. I won't be kept ignorant of things that affect my own well-being." "Also agreed. And the blood." She said it directly, without embarrassment, because embarrassment was a luxury. "However it is collected going forward, it is done with my full knowledge, my full consent, and not one drop more than I can give safely. Dortha always respected that. I expect the same from your healers." Something shifted in his face. That same flicker she had seen earlier, adjacent to something she still couldn't quite name. "My healers will respect whatever terms you set," he said. "You have my word." "The word of a man I met this morning." "Yes," he said simply. "That is all I have to offer you right now." The honesty of it caught her slightly off guard. She had expected negotiation, reassurance, the particular smoothness of a powerful man accustomed to getting what he wanted. Instead, she got 4 plain words and a steadiness that asked nothing of her except to decide. She looked at the maps on the table. The northern territories were marked in dark ink, ridgelines, forest borders, a river she didn't know the name of cutting a long diagonal across the upper portion. The keep was marked with a simple symbol at the center, surrounded by a tight cluster of smaller marks that indicated the pack settlement. "How long is the journey?" she asked. 2 days by horse, less if the weather holds." "Does it usually hold?" "No," he said. She almost smiled. She didn't let herself. "We leave at first light," she said. "I need an hour before that to settle what I'm leaving behind." He nodded. Then, after a pause, "You should know. I travel with two of my pack, Rowan and Dava. They will be with us for the journey and within the keep thereafter." His voice was measured, giving her information without pressure. "Rowan is my second in command. He is cautious by nature. About many things, and about humans in particular." He paused. "I am telling you this, so you are not caught off guard by his reception." Alice absorbed this. "Cautious," she repeated. "Is that a polite word for hostile?" "It is a polite word for a man who has watched his alpha nearly die for 3 years and has very strong opinions about what constitutes a threat. And he thinks I'm a threat." "He thinks the situation surrounding you is a threat," Sebastian said carefully, "which is not the same thing. He will come to understand the difference." She looked at him for a long moment. The dying embers in the hearth made his shadow large and unsteady against the wall behind him. He looked tired, she thought. Not the tiredness of a single bad night, but the deep, pressed-in exhaustion of someone who has been carrying weight for a very long time without being allowed to set it down. "One more thing," she said. "Ask it." "Why you?" She gestured at the room, the maps, the evidence of a man who had come personally rather than send anyone else. "You're an alpha. You could have sent guards to collect me, or sent a message through Dortha, or arranged this 100 ways that didn't require you to sit in a village inn in the middle of the night. Why come yourself?" The question settled into the silence between them. Sebastian looked at her with those deep, storm-colored eyes, and for the first time since he had walked through the door of the collection house that morning, she had the sense that she was seeing something unguarded, some small, careful truth he hadn't planned to offer. "Because you gave something of yourself for 2 years, without knowing who it was for," he said quietly. "And the least I could give you in return was the honesty of my own presence." The embers shifted in the hearth. Outside, the frost continued its slow, patient work across the glass. Alice picked up her satchel. "First light," she said. The horses left the village before the sun had fully cleared the ridge. Alice rode beside Dava, a compact, dark-haired woman with watchful eyes and a short sword at her hip, who had said exactly 4 words to Alice since their introduction. "I'll ride on your left." It was not unfriendly. It was simply functional, and Alice found she respected that. Dava moved with the quiet efficiency of someone who had spent years making herself useful without making herself conspicuous, and she watched the tree line with the kind of steady attention that told Alice she was not watching it for pleasure. Rowan rode ahead. He was perhaps a decade older than Sebastian, leaner, with close-cropped gray at his temples, and a jaw that seemed permanently set against something. He had looked at Alice exactly once, when Sebastian introduced them in the cold blue dark before dawn. A single thorough assessment that lasted perhaps 3 seconds, and revealed nothing of his conclusions. Since then, he had positioned himself at the front of the small group and kept his back to her with a consistency that felt less like rudeness and more like deliberate restraint. He was working very hard not to say something. Alice could feel it. Sebastian rode at the rear. When she glanced back at him, which she told herself she did only to gauge the pace, though that was not entirely honest, he was scanning the forest on both sides of the road with a slow, methodical attention. Not anxious. Alert. The distinction mattered. The road north was old and poorly kept, the packed earth softened by recent rain, into something that pulled at the horses' hooves with every step. The trees on either side were dense and dark, pine mostly, their lower branches heavy with old moisture, the ground beneath them carpeted in brown needles and shadow. The air smelled of wet bark and cold stone and, very faintly, wood smoke from somewhere deep in the forest, where someone had a fire going long before the dawn. By mid-morning, they had left the last village boundary behind them, and the road had narrowed to little more than a track. The sky was the color of old pewter, sealed shut against any possibility of sun, and the wind came in long, cold sweeps from the north that found every gap in Alice's cloak with cheerful precision. She had been warm enough when they set out. She was less warm now. She was also, despite everything she had resolved about being sensible and practical, and not in any way emotionally engaged with any part of this situation, beginning to feel afraid. Not of Sebastian. Not specifically of Rowan, though his silence had a texture to it she didn't enjoy. What she was afraid of was the shapelessness of what she had walked into, the sense that she had agreed to something whose full dimensions she could not yet see, and that those dimensions were larger than the careful, manageable life she had built for herself in that narrow village street. 2 silver coins a month. That was what she had wanted. That was the entirety of her original transaction with the universe. And now she was riding north through a forest that smelled of ancient things, toward a keep she had never heard of, surrounded by wolves who were not yet certain they should trust her. "You're cold." She turned. Sebastian had moved up alongside her without her noticing. The horse was very quiet on the soft earth, or she had been too far inside her own head to hear it. "I'm fine," she said. He looked at her with the expression of a man who is choosing not to argue with something demonstrably untrue, and reached behind him to unstrap a rolled bundle from behind his saddle. He held it out to her. It was a cloak. Heavy wool, the deep brown of pine bark, lined with something soft she couldn't immediately identify. It was large, made for someone considerably broader than she was, and it smelled of leather and wood smoke, and that particular dark iron scent she had noticed when he first walked through the door of the collection house. "It's not elegant," he said, "but it's warm." She looked at it for a moment. Then she took it, because she was cold and practicality outweighed pride. It was enormously too big. It swallowed her cloak underneath it and fell nearly to her stirrups on both sides, and the collar came up to her jaw when she settled it around her shoulders. She was aware, in some distant corner of her awareness, that it probably looked ridiculous. She was also immediately, significantly warmer. "Thank you," she said. From ahead, Rowan's shoulders tightened slightly, just the smallest degree. Alice noticed and said nothing. They rode in silence for another hour. The track climbed steadily, the trees thinning as the elevation increased, the wind strengthening. The first scattering of snow came shortly after noon. Not a proper fall, just a restless shifting of white through the gray air, dusting the pine needles and dissolving against the horses' dark coats almost as soon as it landed. It was during this first snow, while Alice was watching the flakes disappear against the track ahead of her, that Rowan finally pulled his horse back and fell into pace beside her. She waited. "You don't know what you've ridden into," he said, not aggressively, factually. "I know considerably more than I did yesterday," Alice said. "You know what he told you." Rowan kept his eyes on the track. "Which is the version of events shaped by a man who needed something from you. Are you telling me he lied? I'm telling you he simplified." A muscle worked in his jaw. 3 years ago, when the poisoning began, we had enemies on 2 fronts. Sebastian dealt with one. The other went quiet, or appeared to. We assumed they had retreated permanently. He paused. "We were wrong." Alice listened. "The person who poisoned him is not simply an outside enemy. It is someone who has had access to our inner circle, someone who knew the specific compound that would work against his particular bloodline, someone who knew about the collection house and the courier route." His voice was flat and controlled, but beneath it she could hear something that had been ground very fine by 3 years of fear and frustration. Someone who is still close. The snow thickened slightly, whitening the track ahead. "You're telling me the danger isn't only outside the keep," Alice said slowly. "I am telling you that when we arrive, there will be people who smile at you and offer you food and speak warmly about what you have done for the pack." He looked at her then, for the first time since that single assessing glance at dawn. His eyes were dark and very serious. And one of them put that poison in Sebastian's food 3 years ago and has been trying to finish the work ever since. Alice held his gaze. Why are you telling me this? Because you are either the most important person to walk through our gates in 30 years, or you are exactly what whoever is doing this needed to complete it. He turned back to the track. I do not yet know which, but I thought you deserved to know that the question exists. Behind them, she heard Sebastian's horse slow slightly. He had heard. Of course he had heard. She was beginning to understand that very little escaped him. Rowan, Sebastian said quietly. She needed to know, Rowan said, without turning. A long pause. The snow fell soft and cold between them all. Yes, Sebastian said finally. She did. It was not what Alice had expected him to say. She looked back at him, and he was watching her with that steady, complicated expression she had been trying to read since the collection house. And she thought she understood, for the first time, one layer of what it contained. He was not afraid of what Rowan had said. He was afraid of what she would do with it. He was afraid she would run. She faced forward again, pulled the borrowed cloak tighter against the thickening snow, and kept riding. They reached the keep as the last pale light was dissolving behind the western ridge. It rose from the rock of the hillside as though it had grown there rather than been built. Dark stone, massive and old, its towers wrapped in the kind of quiet that comes from deep roots rather than emptiness. Torches burned in iron brackets along the outer wall, their flames bending in the wind, throwing long amber shapes across the snow-dusted ground below. At the gate, a young pack member took the horses. He glanced at Alice with open curiosity, then away quickly when Dava caught his eye. The great doors opened. Light and warmth and the smell of burning pine and roasting meat spilled out across the threshold. And from within the warm interior, a figure stepped forward to greet them. A woman, silver-haired and elegant, with a welcoming smile and pale gray eyes that moved over Alice with an attention so thorough and so carefully disguised as warmth that only someone practiced in watching for exactly that kind of thing would have caught it. Alice caught it. "Welcome," the woman said, her voice rich and steady. "We have been waiting so long for you, dear girl." Behind Alice, she heard Rowan draw a very slow, very quiet breath. The woman's name was Seraphine. She was introduced as the pack's head healer, the one who had designed the collection system, who had found Dortha, who had spent 3 years searching for a counter-agent to the poison, while Sebastian fought to stay alive beneath its slow erosion. She moved through the keep's stone corridors with the ease of someone who had inhabited them for decades, her silver hair pinned back with a carved bone clasp, her robes the deep blue of a healer's rank. Everyone deferred to her. Everyone trusted her. Alice watched her and kept her thoughts behind her teeth. She was given a room on the 2nd level, small but solid, with a proper fireplace, and a window that looked east over the pine forest. The mattress was stuffed with clean wool, and there were 2 thick blankets folded at the foot of it. After 2 years above a grain merchant's storage room, it felt almost unreasonable. Dava brought her a bowl of stew that evening, venison, root vegetables, herbs she couldn't name, and sat with her while she ate without requiring conversation. Alice appreciated this more than she could have explained. The stew was hot, and the fire was good, and for exactly the duration of that meal, she allowed herself to simply be warm and fed, and not thinking. Then she set the bowl aside and began to think. Rowan's words on the road had lodged in her like a splinter. Someone who has had access to our inner circle. Someone who knew the specific compound. Someone still close. Seraphine had designed the collection system. Seraphine knew every detail of how the blood was sourced, transported, and used. She would have known the courier routes. She would have known which donor's blood was producing results. She would have known exactly when to intercept the shipment for maximum damage. Alice turned this over carefully, the way she turned difficult things, without rushing. without letting herself be pulled toward a conclusion before she had enough to support it. She could be wrong. She had no proof. A woman could have watchful eyes behind a warm smile for any number of reasons that had nothing to do with poison and conspiracy. But Alice had spent 5 years reading people from the margins of rooms, from the position of someone that powerful people tended not to account for. And what she had seen in Seraphine's gray eyes when they moved over her in the doorway was not warmth. It was calculation. She went to Sebastian the next morning. He was in the map room, the same kind of space she had seen compressed into a single table at the inn, but expanded here into something that filled an entire stone-walled chamber. Maps covered every surface, weighted and annotated, crisscrossed with routes and boundaries, and notes in a tight, deliberate hand. He was standing at the center table when she entered, and he straightened when he saw her face. "Tell me about Seraphine," Alice said. A pause, brief but present. "She has been with this pack for 20 years, he said carefully. "She trained under my father's healer. When he died, she assumed the role. Does she have any claim to leadership? Any connection to whoever you believe is behind the poisoning?" Sebastian's expression shifted. "Why are you asking this?" "Because she designed the collection system," Alice said, "which means she was the one person who knew with certainty which donor was producing results. Which means she is the one person who could have told whoever intercepted the courier exactly what to destroy and when." The silence in the map room was different from the silences she had encountered elsewhere in the keep. It had more weight. "You noticed something," Sebastian said. It was not a question. "Her eyes," Alice said simply. "When she greeted us at the door, she wasn't looking at me the way you look at someone you're relieved to finally meet. She was looking at me the way you look at a problem you're deciding how to solve." Sebastian was very still. She could see him turning it over, not dismissing it, not defending Seraphine reflexively, but genuinely sitting with what she had said and measuring it against things he already knew. "Rowan has suspected someone in the inner circle for over a year," he said finally. "He hasn't been able to identify who." "Bring him here," Alice said. "And don't tell Seraphine I came to you." Rowan listened to everything Alice said without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment, his dark eyes moving between her face and the maps on the table. Then he said, "The courier who was intercepted. He was given his route by Seraphine the morning he departed. I assigned him at the last moment. She was the only one I told before he left." The three of them stood in the map room while that settled. "We need proof," Sebastian said. His voice was very controlled. "Not suspicion." "The vessels that were destroyed," Alice said. "Where were they intercepted, exactly?" Rowan named a crossing point 2 days south of the keep. A bridge over the river marked on the maps in dark ink. "That bridge is a half-day's ride from a holding," Sebastian said slowly. "An old property. It belonged to the family of a man who challenged my father for the Alpha position 30 years ago. He lost. The family retreated north." He stopped. His jaw tightened. Seraphine's mother was from that family. The fire in the map room hearth was the only sound for a long moment. "She has been healing you," Rowan said, and his voice was very quiet now, the quiet of a man confronting something he should have seen sooner and did not. "For 3 years, she has been the one administering the treatment." "Slowly enough to sustain hope," Alice said. "Quickly enough that you never stopped trusting her." Sebastian's left hand, resting on the table's edge, had gone very still. The tremor was absent. She noticed this, filed it away. Whatever the emotion moving through him right now, it had overridden the physical symptom entirely. "She could have killed me at any point," he said. "Not without consequences," Rowan said. "A sudden Alpha death would have triggered an immediate inquiry. Half the pack would have investigated, inside and out. But a slow decline, followed by the convenient destruction of the only treatment source. He stopped. A death that looked like the poison finally winning, Alice finished, after the healer had done everything she could. They moved that same afternoon, not loudly, not in the way that empties corridors and announces itself. Sebastian requested Seraphine's presence in the lower hall on the pretense of reviewing the treatment schedule for the coming weeks. Rowan positioned 2 trusted pack members at the hall's secondary exits. Dava stayed with Alice in the upper corridor, not because Alice needed guarding, but because Sebastian had asked her to, and Alice had not objected. Alice heard none of what happened in the lower hall directly. She heard it afterward, from Rowan, who told her with the brevity of a man who prefers facts to drama. Seraphine had been confronted with the evidence, the root, the family connection, the 3 years of careful, calibrated treatment that kept Sebastian weak but breathing. For a long moment, by Rowan's account, she had said nothing at all. Then she had looked at Sebastian and said, "Your father took everything from my family. I only wanted to take everything from his." She had not denied it. She had not tried to run. She had simply finally put down the weight of it. The way a person puts down something they have carried long past the point where carrying it made sense, and feels nothing in the moment of release except a terrible, exhausted recognition of how heavy it had always been. She was confined to her chambers pending the Pack Council's judgment. 2 guards at her door, her bone-clasped vials and her blue healer's robes exchanged for plain wool. It was over before supper. 3 weeks later, the treatment resumed. The Pack's second healer, a young woman named Cress, who had trained under Seraphine but possessed, as Rowan put it with characteristic understatement, a considerably less complicated set of motivations, administered it with careful hands and a concentration so intense it was almost endearing. She explained every step to Alice as she worked. Alice listened to every word. Sebastian improved steadily. The gray in his complexion receded. The tremor in his hand diminished over days, then disappeared entirely. He began to sleep properly, which Rowan mentioned only once, gruffly, as though reporting a minor logistical development rather than something that had visibly relieved him. On the morning Alice had been at the keep for exactly 1 month, she found Sebastian in the map room again. He was standing at the window this time, not at the table, looking east over the pine forest, the early light flat and silver against the glass. He was wearing a simpler version of his usual leather and straps, no fur cloak, his braided hair loose around his shoulders. He looked, she thought, like a man who had remembered what it felt like to stand without bracing for something. "Your rent," he said when he heard her come in. He turned from the window. She blinked. "I'm sorry. Your room on Cotter's Lane." A trace of something, not quite a smile, but the structural antecedent of one, moved across his face. "Rowan settled the debt with your landlord. We also arranged for a stipend to be managed in your name, held with a merchant in the village. Enough to secure that room, or another, for as long as you want it." Alice stood in the doorway of the map room and looked at him. The silver morning light fell across the maps on the table, across his face, across the old scar on his cheekbone. He watched her steadily. "You did that without asking me," she said. "I did. I said I wasn't a ward. You're not." His voice was quiet and even. "You're a woman who gave 2 years of herself without being asked, without being thanked, without knowing whether it mattered. What I did does not balance that. It doesn't come close. But it was the only concrete thing I could think of that might make your choices, whatever they are from here, slightly less constrained by circumstance." She was quiet for a moment. "Whatever my choices are," she repeated. "You are free to go back," he said. "You were always free to go back. You should know that plainly." He held her gaze. "You should also know that you are free to stay, not as a donor, not as a resource. as a person who has earned a place here through more courage than most people within these walls have demonstrated in a decade. Alice looked at the maps on the table. The Northern Territories, the ridge lines, the river cutting its long diagonal. The keep's symbol at the center. She had spent a month learning the names of those rivers, those ridges, those forests. She had spent a month learning the names of the people who lived and worked within these stone walls. Cress with her careful hands, Deva with her 4-word vocabulary, Rowan with his grinding, reluctant, entirely genuine protectiveness that she had watched slowly reorganize itself from suspicion into something she was fairly certain he would refuse to call respect if asked directly. She had spent a month waking up in a room that was warm without effort, eating food that was sufficient without calculation, moving through days that did not require her to count the distance between this coin and the next just to keep herself upright. She thought about the narrow staircase on Cotter's Lane, the landlord's letters, the 2 silver coins held tight in her fist on the walk home. She thought about what she had been building, alone, for 5 years, and what she had built here in 1 month, simply by being present and honest and paying attention. "I'll stay through the winter," she said, "and then I'll decide." Sebastian nodded. No pressure, no persuasion. Just the simple acceptance of a man who had learned, perhaps recently, the precise difference between holding on and holding space. She crossed the room and stood beside him at the window, looking east over the pines. The light was strengthening, burning off the flat gray of early morning into something warmer and more definite. Below, the keep was waking. Voices in the courtyard, the smell of bread from the kitchen rising through the cold air, the sound of Dava's boots on the stone steps below. Winter came fast in the north. The snow that dusted the pines that morning was only the beginning of what would cover those ridges by the next moon. The cold would be real and deep and long. But the fire in this keep was well built, and the walls were thick, and the people inside them, complicated and scarred and slowly learning to trust each other, were, she thought, worth staying for. She stayed through the winter. She stayed through the spring that followed it. She stayed. Seraphine faced the Pack Council 6 weeks after her confinement. She was exiled from the Northern Territories permanently. Not executed, because Sebastian would not permit it. A decision that surprised Rowan and no one else. She left on a gray morning, alone, carrying what she could in a single pack. She did not look back at the keep as she rode south. Whatever she carried with her from those gates, she carried in silence. Rowan never fully became a warm man, but he began, in small and stubborn increments, to become a fair one, and Alice discovered that this, in its own way, was worth considerably more. Cress became the pack's head healer before the year was out. She was, by universal agreement, alarmingly competent. And Dava, one quiet evening by the fire, said 11 words to Alice entirely unprompted. Alice counted. She kept the count to herself, but she kept it. Sebastian's hand never trembled again.